So welcome back, everybody. So we're continuing to look at some parables from the White Lotus Sutra over the coming weeks. We've already spent a few weeks looking at the parable of the burning house. So we're not going to be looking at that particularly today. I'll just give a quick summary of that just to tune us into what's been being said over the last few weeks. So paraphrasing the sutra, you've got this burning house, which is a metaphor for everyday samsaric conditioned life. And the Buddha is encouraging us to escape from the danger of the burning house. And we could say that's encouraging us to escape from the greed, hatred, and delusion, which is one way of looking at how the burning house is actually burning. And if you look at the Buddha's teaching, he offers the vision of enlightenment as encouragement to escape from conditioned existence. So that's what in summary, that's what the parable of the burning house might be looking at. And we're going to be looking at a few other short parables in the talk today. But in the parable of the burning house, the children, which is us, don't notice or even really care that the house is on fire. They're caught up in doing their regular stuff. So this is a little bit like our situation. We're used to living everyday life where we don't really quite see clearly how somewhat fraught and how dangerous, you could say in some way, that our life is, because there is greed, hatred, and delusion. So if somebody said to you, "Oh, you need to practice the Dharma because your everyday life is full of greed, hatred, and delusion," you wouldn't actually be that inspired to do very much about it. That's just not how we're wired up. We wouldn't give much attention to that. So we need to be given a vision of enlightenment where we can go beyond where we currently are to a more inspiring and more fulfilling and more desirable way to live, you could say. And for me personally, it was very much this vision of enlightenment which got me practicing the Dharma in the first place. In fact, the first time I read anything about Buddhism, it was a story. I won't go into it now, but for those of you who know the story of Kisagotami, where this poor lady has a dead child she can't bear it, and she goes to see the Buddha, and he gives him some profoundly wise advice, which helps her eventually to get over the loss and actually become a disciple of the Buddha. So this, for me, was the vision of enlightenment. This was the wisdom of the Buddha being presented in a way that I could take on board. And so we could say that's part of the vision aspect of the path at some level. But Sangharakshita Bhante, our founder, he's very much like to talk in terms of the path as being one of vision and transformation. So if I look at my life personally, I was very much into the path of vision. I found that really inspiring. But the path of transformation seemed a lot like hard work. You sort of look at all the different aspects of you, and what it seems to be saying, if you take it too literally, is you've got all these different bits of you which have to be transformed. And that's part of the path as well. And it might seem just like a bit too much like hard work, and maybe not even possible. So personally, I have to say, I'll get onto the parable in a minute, but I'm sort of giving a bit of a clue as to how the parable might have done me some good earlier on. Maybe that'd be interesting for you to have a look at. So basically, at the start, transformation didn't really feature too heavily in my thinking at all. Intellectually, yeah, well, I might have spouted something like that, given the right setting, but I didn't really feel it. I didn't really feel really emotionally very engaged with the idea of transformation, but vision was very much on my agenda. That was inspiring. And we could say that the parable of the burning house is, in a way, sort of more in the area of vision, like escaping from where we are to somewhere far more desirable. Mansion of enlightenment, maybe you could say. And there's a hope this is interesting and maybe a little bit entertaining. Is a bit of an anecdote from my own life. And years ago, 20 years ago, I was in the ordination process, and I was getting close to ordination. An order member I knew, he said, I was Julian at the time, so Julian's really been working on, he's really been working on himself. And thought, like, internally, I thought, have I hell? I haven't been doing any working on myself at all in any conscious way. That was not how I thought about the Buddhist life. Transformation didn't really figure very consciously in the way I thought about the path. And in fact, when I reflected on it years down the line, a couple of decades of hindsight, I've realized that the way I was practicing to start off was that I was practicing the Dharma because I like the idea of enlightenment, and I practiced not to transform myself, just to wake up one day enlightened. How bonkers is that? But anyway, that was how my mind worked in those days. So a bit of my dirty laundry there out on display. But so that was how my strange psychology worked in the early days. So I didn't really take on board the idea of transformation. And I think one idea I'm going to suggest here is that the parable which I'm about to read may be one way of giving us sort of some encouragement and inspiring encouragement to take on board the idea of transformation. So I'll read this parable as it's a slightly dated translation, but it's rather a nice translation. It takes a few minutes to read. And this is a version of what's called the parable of the rain cloud. So it is quite well known to quite a few people here. So this is parable of the rain cloud. It's a translation of a Chinese translation. So it's probably not. Well, hopefully it's close enough to the original. And it starts off in very dated language. It is like unto a great cloud rising above the world, covering all things everywhere. A gracious cloud full of moisture. Lightning flames flash and dazzle. Voice of thunder vibrates afar, bringing joy and ease to all. The sun's rays are veiled, and the earth is cooled. The cloud lowers and spreads, as if it might be caught and gathered. Its rain everywhere equally descends on all sides, streaming and pouring unstinted, permeating the land. On mountains, by rivers, in valleys, in hidden recesses, there grow the plants, trees, and herbs. Trees both great and small. The shoots of the ripening grain, grapevine and sugarcane. Fertilized are these by the rain and abundantly enriched. The dry ground is soaked. Herbs and trees flourish together. From the one water which issued from that cloud, plants, trees, thickets, forests, according to need, receive moisture. All the various trees, lofty, medium, low, each according to its size, grows and develops roots, stalks, branches, leaves, blossoms and fruits in their brilliant colours. Wherever the one rain reaches, all become fresh and glossy, according as their bodies, forms, and natures are great or small. So the enriching rain, though it is one and the same, makes each of them flourish. In like manner also the Buddha appears here in the world, like unto a great cloud, universally covering all things. And having appeared in the world, he, for the sake of the living, discriminates and proclaims the truth in regard to all laws. The great holy world-honoured one, among gods and men and among other beings, proclaims abroad his word. And it carries on, but I'll leave it there. So basically, it's quite a straightforward parable, and it's basically saying the Dharma, as dispensed by the Buddha, is like a rain cloud which rains on all things equally. The rain is not partial as to where it's going to land. It's totally impartial, and importantly, in spiritual terms, it rains and it allows things to grow according to their own nature. So an acorn grows up to be the tree which acorns come from, and maybe that's oaks, I don't know. If you've got a herb and you get some moisture, you turn into a bigger, a bit more advanced herb, maybe. And if you're a rose and you come from a seed, if that's what I'm not a gardener, as you can probably gather. But they get you basically grow according to your own nature. So this is a really important spiritual point, that you grow according to your own nature. So this is one of the important messages from this. So as we practice the Dharma, we don't become someone else. It's much more like we become more fully ourselves. We manifest our true nature more and more fully. So if we could think of this parable as talking in terms of unfoldment. Our true nature unfolds with time as we continue to practice the Dharma. A progressive unfoldment of our potential, maybe you could say. And we might be inspired by this idea. So I think this is where, for someone who didn't necessarily get on too well with the idea of transformation early on, because it just seemed like a little bit too much like hard work. If I really taken on board the idea that we grow according to our own nature, and our own nature is quite good enough for gaining enlightenment. Not to say it's going to be easy, but our nature is perfectly adequate for gaining enlightenment, and we grow according to that nature. For me, that's a much more inspiring way of thinking about transformation, rather than thinking in terms of all the really hard work which is necessary for that transformation to happen. So when I was certainly early doors, I didn't take on the idea that we kind of embrace our own nature more and more fully and allow it to become more and more established. It was more like I had the vision of becoming somebody else. There's me now, and there's somebody else who's enlightened. This is not me. Now, that's of course a wrong view, but it's a kind of a literal understanding of where the idea of a path or a journey, if we take it too literally, might lead us to think in a somewhat unhelpful way. And I think this is where the one way in which this parable could be really helpful. So it can maybe help us to get over the view that our nature is not good enough to become enlightened. It is perfectly good enough. We just grow according to our own nature, as does everybody else. Now, one thing which it occurred to me that if we think that this is deep down, it's not so much thinking, sort of maybe have a deep view that we're not quite good enough. One thing which might happen as a result of that is that we don't take our current experience very seriously, or really want to experience what we're currently experiencing. If you've got this view that this is not good enough. And if we can get over that view that we're basically not good enough, and think, start to take on board the idea that our nature is perfectly good enough for becoming enlightened. Maybe hard work, but we have got what it takes in terms of our potential, because our potential was the same as everybody else's, and that's full and perfect enlightenment. Now, if we can take that on board, that our nature is good enough, what we're experiencing is basically a seed from which, or is a starting point from which we can grow and develop. We may be able to take on board and basically accept and acknowledge and be with our current experience, something which I was not very keen on doing early on, but as time's gone on, definitely been more able to just basically stay with one's experience. And this is actually a really important way of practicing, particularly meditation. And we don't have to all the time spend loads of time to try and cultivate something which we're not currently experiencing. One way of practicing, which we can really think in terms of unfoldment, is actually just staying with our experience without judgment, without trying to push it away, without necessarily making any effort at all to be somewhere other than where we are. Now, if we can practice in that way, unfoldment will undoubtedly happen. If we can just stay with our experience in a non-judgmental way, not pushing it away, just allowing it to be there with a kindly awareness. So that's one thing which maybe this kind of perspective of this parable might help us to move in the direction, well, a direction we might creatively go in. And Sangharakshita has written that he reckons that if we take something like the parable of the burning house too literally, it may seem that enlightenment sort of happens rather externally rather than internally. It's not as if we grow and develop, it's more like we go somewhere else, just sort of different terms, what I've been talking about earlier, that the changes might be seen as an external one rather than an internal one. And this parable of the rain cloud very much talks in terms of the internal process. It's more about growing according to your own nature. And Sangharakshita also like to talk in terms of that if we take the idea of path too literally, it's as if we traverse the path, but we are not changed by it. We just move along a path, again, which is a somewhat unhelpful way of thinking. So again, this parable, which very much talks in terms of an internal, you could say an internal path of growth and development, could mitigate against a rather literal idea that we are unchanged by traversing the path, which is not a very helpful idea. Dante also thought that it's also possible that we might have or one of the things we might fall foul of is could say mistaking a better intellectual of the Dharma and of the path and of the goal instead of actually practicing and experiencing change. So probably a number of us, and me included, when you first start out, I quite a lot of books, quite a good pile of books, and I read all of them very avidly. I didn't reflect on any of them really, I have to say, and so I didn't really maybe get as much out of them as I could have done. That's where I started. I started off as quite a cerebral person. Everything's a little bit different now. So we need to take time to actually practice the Dharma, inspired though we may be by the ideas we read about in books. I wonder if someone could get me some water. Right, so that was the first parable, which I wanted to talk about today. Now we're going to move on to another one, which is quite short, and in a way is actually very similar. It has a kind of similar message, just in slightly different terms. So this is sometimes called the parable of the sun and the moon. The Tathagata, which means the Buddha, in his educating creatures, is equal and not unequal. As the light of the sun and moon Kashapa shines upon all the world, upon the virtuous and the wicked, upon the high and low, upon the fragrant and ill-smelling, all their beams are sent down upon everything equally, without inequality. So too Kashapa, the intellectual light of the knowledge of the omniscient, the Tathagatas, the Arhats, the preaching of the true law proceeds equally in respect to all beings in the 5 states of existence, to all who, according to their particular disposition, are devoted to the great vehicle. Nor is there any deficiency or excess in the brightness of the Tathagata knowledge up to one's becoming fully acquainted with the law. So this is, in a way, very similar kind of message to the parable of the rain cloud. But maybe we can draw, and Sangharakshita draws a little bit more from that, to suggest maybe there's a particular understanding we might draw from that, which might be helpful. So as a plant needs to be nourished by both rain and sunlight, the 2 parables talking about sunlight and the rain, they have pretty much the same meaning. They're both, rain and the sun are dispensed impartially to all plants, but both are indispensable for the growth of the plant. And likewise, the Buddha taught the Dharma for the benefit of all. He communicated the higher state of consciousness to all. There was no partiality. So as the plants are nourished by water from down below and the light from above, if we take this to the human realm, we might talk about, this is how Sangharakshita talks, is that we need to be spiritually nourished by the unconscious depths, getting contact with those, as well as the kind of the higher level, the supra-personal heights, the strong and inspiring experiences, maybe we could say. So we could think in those terms, but he may put a little bit more simply, and he thought one way of looking at these 2 different dimensions, the rain if descending, but then coming up from below into the plant, and the light coming down, we could think in terms of reason and emotion. So we might think about the sunlight as being a bit of a metaphor for the intellectual light, you could say, which is borrowing a term from that translation of that parable. And then the more emotional stuff, which is more sort of like the depths, you could say. So basically, we could say that if we look at those 2 parables together, we might think in terms of reason and emotion, both being necessary for the proper development of the human being along the path of the Dharma. And we've got different teachings which appeal to different aspects of us. So we've got the symbolic teachings of the White Lotus Sutra, which is all rather mythic and story-based. Then you've got teachings like the Noble Eightfold Path, the four actions, 3 actions, the 4 Noble Truths. So these are all sort of intellectual, they're quite clear, intellectually graspable kind of ideas. But it may be that the more story-based ones are going to appeal to more to our emotions, maybe than the intellectual ones. And Sangharakshita says something which is a bit challenging, but when I think about it, it's actually right on the money. And he says here, when you come into contact with the Buddha's teaching, do you feel like you're drinking in spiritual sunshine? Do you feel that we are growing or expanding even just a little bit? If not, our understanding is purely intellectual. So that's pretty good and hearted. So do you feel like you're drinking in spiritual sunshine when you come in contact with the Buddha's teaching? And if not, then your understanding is purely intellectual. So it's something to rattle your cage with. So that's one thing which is, I think, very, very clearly and well expressed by Bhante in this particular book here. Actually, if you're interested in the White Lotus Sutra, this is called a book called The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, probably out of print in this particular form, but available in the full complete works of Sangharakshita. So something to say about, well, why, maybe I'll say a little bit about why reason and emotion are both required in the Buddhist life. So it may be clear, it may be perfectly clear that but I'd like to make a few points just in case it's helpful. So a little while back, I gave a talk about faith or Shraddha, as it's called in Buddhist terminology. And in that, Padmasambhava talks a lot about and makes a great case for faith as being pretty much the most important thing in the Dharma life. Without a conviction or kind of a confidence and trust in the Dharma, we're not really going to make any attempt to grow and develop. So we need to be motivated at the emotional level. We're emotional beings. We generally act on the basis of emotions rather than thoughts. Maybe not the case all the time, but primarily we're quite emotional beings. So our emotions need to be appealed to. So without the positive emotion of confidence and trust, which is at the emotional level, there's not really a Dharma life. So one thing we might do is, and I found this particularly helpful, is when we have a Dharma teaching presented to us, it's very important to notice, well, first of all, do we understand it? First, get a decent understanding of it. But then again, what do we feel about it? How do we actually respond at the emotional level to the teaching? Because in that response, there's a great deal of spiritual treasure. We can really start to grasp teachings much more deeply and fully and comprehensively if we start to visit our emotional response to teachings. And another thing to say about reason and emotion is that if our Dharma life is to be alive and vibrant, it needs to capture our imagination. Without that, we're not going to be inspired. But if it does capture our imagination, we're going to be inspired. And Sangharakshita said very well that imagination involves a synthesis of reason and emotion. You need both of those to be present and reasonably alive for our imagination to really to flourish. And we need that imagination to flourish for our Dharma life to progress. Yeah, coming close to all I wanted to say today before we go into groups. But another thing I wanted to say about reason and emotion in relation to communication and the benefits that that can bring. So if we can bring both our emotions and our reason together, we can affect people very strongly with our communication. And I've had just probably only 2 occasions of that in my life. But if you were here a couple of weeks ago, Padmasambhava gave a talk, and he's someone who seems to me to be very strongly in touch of both reason and emotion. And as a result, his talks can really quite strongly affect people because he's very clear intellectually, but he's also very much in contact with his emotional response, particularly to Sangharakshita, but also to Dharma teachings generally and the whole Buddhist life. So he's kind of an exemplar of reason and emotion coming together in one person to a very powerful effect. Right, that's all I wanted to say. So we've got a bit of time now to go into groups. We've got about a quarter of an hour or so. So I've just got a couple of questions which you might like to talk about. So one thing which you might like to consider is like, how do you respond to the idea that you grow according to your own nature? You don't grow according to an idealized idea of how you think you should develop. You grow according to your own nature. You don't need to become someone else, but you become more fully yourself. So that's one thing you might like to discuss, the idea of growing according to your own nature, and that's perfectly adequate for traversing the Dharma path. You might also like to think, do you believe reason and emotion are both equally important in the Dharma life? And which one do you favour? May that be an interesting thing to talk about. You probably won't get through these three questions, but if any of these questions grab you, maybe you'd like to talk about them. And here's the challenging one. Do you sometimes feel like you are drinking in sunshine when you engage with the Buddha's teachings? So there's a big ask. So that's something you might like to consider, if on occasion you do have that sense of actually drinking in something profoundly nourishing.